Hi, I'm Dr. Les Spry. I'm a nephrologist, or in my words, I guess I'm a kidney guy. I'm joined today by my friend and colleague, Dr. Laura Byam-Gray. Laura is a dietitian who specializes in the area of nutrition in chronic kidney disease. Together, we'll be discussing the important topic of high potassium as it relates to your kidneys. Our hope is that by the end of this video, you'll be able to better understand the impact of potassium and diet on you and your kidneys. First of all, what I'd like to do would be to at least set the stage here and perhaps define and talk a little bit about high blood potassium, which we call hyperkalemia. High blood potassium is an elevation in the chemical of potassium that's in your blood. Potassium is one of what we call the electrolytes in your blood, and potassium is intimately involved in all the electricity that happens inside of your body. It's intimately involved in the heart and muscles of your body, and so any change in blood potassium leads to complications such as heart problems, and in some cases can even cause stoppage of the heart. It can also cause muscle weakness as well as muscle cramps. I wanted to talk just a little bit about the risk factors for hyperkalemia, which include chronic kidney disease. We see high blood potassiums that occur in chronic kidney disease. We also see high blood potassiums that occur in other individuals that include people with heart disease, congestive heart failure, diabetes, and certain other problems associated with the elderly. One of the most common questions that I get from my patients as well as on my blog has to do with diet. So I'd like to ask Laura if she would tell us a little bit about how she counsels people with chronic kidney disease and their diet.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Spry. I think one of the key factors to remember is that everybody's needs nutritionally are very different. So it depends on what level or spectrum of kidney disease they have. So it's important for patients to have an open conversation with a nephrologist and follow up to find out what are their numbers, what is their kidney function. And if they're at the early stages of kidney disease, what we call stages 1 through 3, they should follow a DASH diet, which DASH stands for the Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. It was a trial that was done over 20 years ago that focused on a plant-based diet. It's healthy for everybody, focusing less on animal protein foods, higher fruits and vegetables, trying to push more calcium, magnesium, potassium, and lowering sodium. All of these factors have helped to lower blood pressure, which is the second leading cause for kidney disease. So in earlier stages of chronic kidney disease, potassium-rich foods are extremely important and helpful, as well as looking at other ways to lower weight, reduce blood pressure, exercise, stop smoking. So one of the other factors we always have to be mindful of is if the patient does progress to later stages of kidney disease, we may need to modify the potassium content, and we could take them or tell them to decrease the amount of fruits or vegetables, which may seem contraindicated sometimes.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, patients get a little frustrated out there because there's always this or that fad diet that comes on the scene.
Absolutely, yeah.
And especially for diabetics. However, I have to say that people with chronic kidney disease, you mentioned the second most common cause of kidney disease today is high blood pressure, and the first leading cause of kidney disease is diabetes. Many diabetics do run into complications related to potassium. They frequently have other complications. The most common cause of death in patients who have chronic kidney disease is actually heart disease and cardiovascular complications such as stroke. And it's interesting to note that many of the drugs that we use to treat chronic kidney disease out there are also used to treat heart disease, also used to treat high blood pressure. Those drugs include things like ACE inhibitors or what we call ARB agents. We also use certain drugs that are known as mineralocorticoid antagonists, and that's a big doctor word, but basically it means that we use drugs to change the way in which your blood pressure and potassium works in your body. We also use drugs in heart disease known as beta blockers, and interestingly enough, all of these drugs are associated with hyperkalemia. So when we start dealing with these people who have risk factors for hyperkalemia, one of the first things we do is we review their diet and ask a dietitian to counsel them. And what would you counsel somebody who presents to you with high blood pressure or with high potassium?
Well, one of the things we would take a look at is obviously what types of foods do they enjoy in their diet? Because as a dietitian for many years, I never wanted to take the enjoyment out of eating for patients. And so what may work for one patient may not work for the other. So it's really taking a history and finding out what is their common pattern. So then we can hone in on what may be challenges or problem areas. As you mentioned, there's some real life-threatening risks associated with hyperkalemia. So it's not to be taken lightly. And we also have to look at what is their treatment plan. If they're early stages of chronic kidney disease, we might be able to be a little bit more what we would call liberal with their potassium content and look at portion sizes and trying to help them plan throughout the day. But if they're on dialysis or even with some of the transplantation drugs that you mentioned, we might have to be much more, not restrictive, but much more controlled in terms of their potassium intake and helping them to be mindful of portion sizes. And if they do enjoy a high potassium food, such as potatoes or bananas, there are ways that you can lower the amount of potassium in those foods safely, and so that they can still enjoy it and feel like they're part of the family, part of the event if they're going out to eat. So it takes a lot of communication. It's having that great relationship with the patient and talking to them and helping them to realize that this isn't insurmountable, and what may work for Mr. Brown may not work for Mrs. Smith.
Absolutely. I know my patients express a lot of frustration, and when they talk to dietitians, it's very good that they listen to what they do, and then, because they're always wanting to say, should I stop this food or should I use this food? And actually what you do is you listen to what they're doing, as you said, and then try to modify that.
Right.
Well, so the next thing that usually comes up in relationship to this is, all right, so we've adjusted the diet, and then we're going to have to look at why is this person still showing a high blood potassium. And high blood potassium can be, as we talked about, life-threatening. It can cause heart stoppage, it can cause muscle weakness, it can cause, in fact, I've seen it cause falls. I've seen patients who develop severe cardiac arrhythmias as a result of this. So once we start seeing the bad manifestations of hyperkalemia, then we have to start looking at what that patient's doing. Again, risk factors we talked about were heart disease, diabetes, and drugs that are associated with it, but we have a number of other drugs that patients use. For example, certain antibiotics. You mentioned transplant drugs. We see this in transplant drugs as a direct complication of the drugs that they're taking, that the blood potassium goes up. And so when we're not able to lower those potassium, blood potassiums with diet alone, then we start looking back at drugs. We mentioned beta blockers that can be included in there, and one of the most common drugs that I see causing high blood potassium is drugs that are called non-steroidal agents. Things such as ibuprofen, Aleve, Advil, Naproxen, all of those non-steroidal agents are things that we really don't like in kidney disease in the first place, but they directly cause high potassiums. And so I try to stop all of those drugs if we can, or adjust them. The other question that comes up again is diabetic control in these folks. And I know that you counsel a lot of diabetics about this. The careful control of diabetes is essential in keeping potassiums down. And I know you have some experience with counseling diabetics in this regard too.
Absolutely, and that's probably the most difficult balancing act, is that the patient may have presented, let's say, with kidney disease, but they've had decades of diabetes management. And so now we have to really meld these two areas so that they feel like they can eat safely, that they can take the benefit of that. But it's important for them to control their blood sugar, to make sure that they're checking themselves, having the self-management techniques that are appropriate. Because if their blood sugar runs high, that can affect their potassium levels as well. So it's helping them change their lifestyle, which can be incredibly difficult, especially where they may be or how they presented with kidney disease, and it can be very overwhelming. So what we try to do is to educate them one step at a time. Keep the patient safe. What's the most critical issue hand, obviously preventing hyperkalemia being one of them, and having that discussion with them over weeks, years, so that they can understand what to look for and what to really monitor. And I guess one of the questions that I always hear is that the physician is concerned about my potassium level, and we may look at their diet. What type of information do you share with them if we really can't seem to identify what is that critical piece? That if diet, they seem to be doing pretty well, because we don't want them to be overly restrictive, so then they end up being malnourished. So it's really important.
Absolutely. So once we go through the drugs that they're taking, once we go through the dietary type of information, then we start looking at the treatment of high blood potassiums. We can actually end up using water pills. Water pills actually cause the kidney to waste potassium, and so we can sometimes use diuretics or water pills to lower potassium. If the high blood potassium is related to an excess of acid in the blood, it turns out that I can just give them baking soda. Pressed baking soda tablets are sometimes enough to correct that mild elevation of potassium because there's acid building up in the blood. And we now know from clinical studies that if we can keep that bicarbonate level in their blood, again, this is another chemical that's in the blood, but we shoot to keep that bicarbonate level more than 22. If we can keep it more than 22, then that is associated with decreased risk of progression of kidney disease, and it also helps to lower potassium. Finally, if those two little tricks don't work, then the next thing that we're looking at is using drugs to help lower potassium. And we have certain binders that are now available for us. We have an older binder and a newer binder that's now available for the treatment of high potassium. And sometimes in those folks who have heart disease or who have kidney disease, it's important to keep them on those ACE inhibitors or ARB agents, or in some cases the mineralocorticoid antagonist. In other words, continue the drugs that are causing the hyperkalemia. And we now have drugs that can actually help to lower the blood potassium by acting as binders. And as I said, we now have some agents on the market that are allowing us to do that. There's a newer agent and an older agent that's available. And in those situations, you're going to have to talk with your physician because those have to be prescribed for the most part.
So Dr. Spry, how often should patients monitor their potassium levels? Does it matter?
It does. If the potassium is anything above 5, I usually recommend that they have their potassium checked at least quarterly, every quarter. And I also keep checking it perhaps every week or two until it's back below 5 in some cases. Now again, exactly what level of potassium to go on is always a little bit controversial, but as I said, each nephrologist sort of knows their patient, they know what they're capable of. One of the first things we do, as I mentioned, potassium is involved in all the electricity in your body. And so when I want to know if that blood potassium is high enough to cause problems, the first thing I can just do is an electrocardiogram. In other words, do an EKG. Okay. And that gives me, excuse me, that gives me direct information about what the potassium is doing inside of the body. So doing an EKG, or perhaps just asking the patient whether or not they have any muscular weakness. Those are the important things that we do in order to try to monitor the patient's potassium. Obviously, monitoring kidney function. Kidney function is the critical variable that is responsible for a high blood potassium. Monitoring blood sugars. If the blood sugars are particularly out of control, those folks tend to have much higher potassiums, and so that's when we throw it back to back to their endocrinologist to say we need better control of this person's diabetes, or the dietitian by saying this person's diabetes has to be under better control, or else the treatment of last resort for patients who have hyperkalemia is always dialysis. And so choosing dialysis is something we don't do. We want to be very careful because dialysis is a major step. But in some cases, if we just cannot control the potassium, dialysis becomes an outcome. And then that's when the very strict dietary control of potassium becomes more of a problem.
Yeah, and I think that it also relates to the type of type of dialysis that they're, using as their treatment, where they may be on peritoneal dialysis and they're able to filter out the excess potassium from their bloodstream a little bit, more like a typical kidney. We don't have to be as careful necessarily. Sometimes we may actually encourage them to eat more high potassium foods. If they're on hemodialysis in center versus at home, where I try to explain to patients that, we're only filtering your blood 3 times a week, where your healthy kidneys did it every day, 24 hours a day. So there can be that buildup of hyperkalemia or a buildup of potassium. So that's where it becomes extremely important, and why we, especially if there's an extended period of time that they go without dialysis, that we have to make sure that they're careful. One time a patient had asked about a particular food, watermelon I believe it was at the time, and he had consumed not the normal size portion of watermelon, and it can have an immediate reaction in terms of the elevation in his potassium. So it was a learning message for me, is that you have to be sure that the patient understands the portion size if it is what we would call a food that they could incorporate into their diet, because that's not always clear to patients, and that we have to make sure that that is communicated openly and clearly.
I have the same experience that you do in that many of my home patients really rarely have potassium problems, and even though for peritoneal dialysis they're on dialysis every day, and that helps to keep the potassium much more uniform. With my home hemodialysis, they're on dialysis more frequently, and so controlling their potassium is generally not a problem. But the biggest problem I have is with in-center patients, as you mentioned. And in fact, that leads me to the next question, and that is that we have a seasonality to hyperkalemia in this country. And this time of year in the fall, everybody's picking gardens, picking tomatoes, and picking all, and sharing them with everybody. And so, and there's also certain ethnic, I get questions, I know on my website from during Ramadan, when people are fasting, and what can I do to avoid hyperkalemia in some of those situations.
Right, absolutely. So I think seasonality is a good one, and we try to emphasize it, as especially in various regions of the country where perhaps fruits and vegetables that are fresh aren't as common as they might be, let's say in the Northeast, where we may be relying on other types of food sources, that we encourage the patients to certainly take advantage of these foods. They're healthy foods, but they have to recognize that they can get into danger very quickly. And so we educate them on when may be the best time to eat them, how to prepare them. The National Kidney Foundation has a wonderful resource online that helps to identify what are some of what we would consider high potassium foods, especially during various seasons. So dietitians, your healthcare team, are always a great source of information, and also looking at cultural habits, ethnic habits, trying to understand about the types of foods that they may be consuming. There are wonderful databases now that focus on specific cultural foods, so that we can help them learn too what may be an appropriate portion size. I've used for years, as silly as it may sound, but rubber food bottles that show what an actual portion size is. Because when you look at what the typical American consumes, it's 2 or 3 times that amount. So we have to make sure we're talking the same language so that we don't run into problems.
Another thing that I commonly get asked about, and I usually have my dietitian discuss that, is supplements. We have a lot of people, in fact, on dialysis, we used to restrict protein intake on dialysis when I first started doing this 30 years ago, and now we know that that was a bad idea because we run into some significant problems with protein malnutrition. But we now, there's lots and lots of supplements out there on the market, and so could you talk just a little bit about supplements, especially in relationship to potassium, because I know there are supplements that are lower and some supplements that are higher.
Right, absolutely. So there's many different types of nutritional supplements. There are complete nutritionals where they have carbohydrate, protein, fat, They're to give you energy, they're meal replacers, but oftentimes they can be very high in potassium depending on the portion of them. So what's positive now on the food labels, potassium is listed. So typically anything that's above 200 milligrams per serving, we want to take a little bit of caution with that if you're instructed to watch or monitor your potassium intake. So it depends on what the goal is. I always encourage patients, tell your nephrologist, tell your dietitian, tell the team if you're taking anything over the counter. Many dietary supplements can be sources of potassium as well as other minerals, phosphorus, that we would be concerned about. And I show them if they have a smartphone or if they have computer access, or even if they don't, what are some resources that they can look at to actually search up some of the supplements that they're taking. Fortunately, the food labels, the nutrient labels have improved dramatically over the last 20, 25 years, so they can be a source of great information. But many times my patients would bring in bottles into a grocery bag so that I could take a look at it. But I wanted to have that conversation with them and let them feel comfortable and find out what was the purpose for them taking these particular items, and was it replacing something that they could be consuming, because nutrient supplements can be very expensive. So we want to make sure that their diet first, food first, is adequate and balanced, and then if they need additional supplementation, we would work with the nephrology team, because many times I would believe nephrologists prescribe various vitamins based on their unique nutritional requirements too.
Another area that I have to re-educate many patients on is the area of sports drinks. Mm-hmm. Sports drinks are thought to be something that you have to do every time you sweat, right. But it turns out for my kidney patients that's not a good idea, because right. Not only do they contain salt, yes. But they contain potassium, and mm-hmm. That can be a real source of problems. So mm-hmm. I want my patients to exercise, yep. But there's now this mentality out there that if I exercise, I must have a drink mm-hmm. with yes. That. And so I continue to encourage them to drink water.
Right.
I want to change the subject just a little bit. We briefly mentioned transplant, but I'm hoping that there are some transplant people in the audience. Post-transplant hyperkalemia is a very difficult problem. Mm-hmm. Many of the drugs that we use after transplantation are associated with hyperkalemia. Mm-hmm. Some of the drugs like Bactrim and Septra mm-hmm. that we use to prevent infections in our transplants are associated with hyperkalemia. Many of the blood pressure medicines that we use for our patients who have high blood pressure after their transplant also have hyperkalemia. So, mm-hmm. And then the final thing that happens after transplant is they feel so good right. that all of a sudden they want to eat
everything.
Yeah. And sure. So how do you counsel transplant patients after the transplant?
You have to start it early, and it's even at the time when they're being evaluated for transplantation to recognize that transplantation is a wonderful treatment option if it's successful, but they still are managing their disease. So it's important for them to understand that the medications that they're taking, as well as how they're exercising, other types of lifestyle behaviors, making sure they're not smoking or start smoking again, but also looking at their meal structure, because many of the medications can give them a tremendous appetite if that's difficult for them, because they are feeling so well, they feel almost liberated, that we have to remind them that we don't want you gaining weight. We want to make sure your blood sugar stays in check. We want to be careful in looking at what their lab values are. And that's great coordination between the transplantation team after transplantation, and then with the nephrologist in care afterwards. And so, I think sometimes patients may feel it's like, oh, I have a healthy kidney now. I don't need to worry about my diet. We don't want them worrying ever about their diet. We want it to become part of their lifestyle so that they feel like it's just part of a normal practice, but we want them also to recognize that there can be some long-term consequences.
In my patients with chronic kidney disease, I said the most common cause of death is still going to be heart disease. Mm-hmm. And heart disease including congestive heart failure. And so in our patients with congestive heart failure, we commonly also use the same as the drugs as we do in the kidney disease. Those drugs are ACE inhibitors and ARB agents for the most part, and to some extent beta blockers, because all of those drugs have been associated with improved longevity, both in kidney disease but also in heart disease. And unfortunately, there's this balance between salt intake and potassium intake, and the other thing obviously that we want all of our heart failure patients to do is to have a low salt diet, but achieving a low potassium diet when you're already on a low salt diet, then my patients start saying, but I can't eat anything.
Yeah, that's a common complaint. So we try to help them kind of roll back and start to look at wonderful ways that you can use seasonings, herbs, so that the food has flavor. And obviously, the salt taste is learned. So as we start to decrease the amount of sodium in their diet, they'll start to recognize that, you know, foods taste better. Because you'll be amazed when they go out to restaurants that maybe the soup is saltier than they originally had remembered, because they've now adapted to that. So what you don't want them to do is to use a salt substitute for a low sodium diet, because those contain potassium.
Yeah, those are, people forget that both light salt and no salt are
not
potassium.
Right, exactly. It's potassium chloride. So you're exchanging one to, you know, a lesser of an evil. But the important factor is that we try to help them look at new ways of cooking, trying new foods, so that they don't feel that the diet is bland or that it lacks a lot of taste.
And in our patients who have chronic congestive heart failure and want to be on those drugs, those are when we start using those potassium binding drugs that we talked about. So in order to continue those drugs that are associated with improved cardiac survival, we will commonly use those potassium binding substances. In fact, that's what they're approved for, is so that you can continue those drugs that are been shown to actually improve outcomes in heart disease. I'd like to thank all of you who joined us today. And at this time, I'd like to suggest that we take some questions from the viewers. So, if anyone has a question on this subject, please post them in the comment section and we'll do our best to answer them. So we're looking for any questions that you may have out there. First question that I'd like to ask Dr. Bonagre is to talk about the types of foods that are very rich in potassium, the ones that we most commonly quiz patients about as to whether or not they're taking those.
Okay, yeah, that's a great way to look at it. You try to make it appear like you're not testing them, but especially those foods that we, generally think are healthy or high in potassium. So it's mostly your fruits and vegetables, your whole grains, nuts, seeds, legumes. They're also higher in phosphorus, so that becomes another concern. So that's where I, as a dietitian, try to help them understand it's not that these foods are taboo, but we need to watch them, we need to control them, because I've sometimes had the response, it's like, well, you're telling me to take away all these healthy foods that I enjoy, and we don't want that message to be meant or shared. So we want to help them understand that it's looking at what their levels are, following up with their nephrologist, get their testing done, and seeing how you respond to various changes in your diet.
And the other thing that I commonly get asked about is, so what's some reliable sources of information about what's the potassium content of foods? I know in my case, when I'm in my blog, I use a United States Department of Agriculture website. It's called nbd.nal.usda.gov. But basically, it's a website where you can type in the food, and it's a database from the federal government that tells you the milligram and milliequivalent contents of these things. However, that's kind of technical.
It is.
And patients don't really want technical, they want numbers.
Right.
So can you share some sources of information with us?
Absolutely. That's a great website. Absolutely. You'll get the raw data, as we say, in terms of the nutrient content. But they can go to the National Kidney Foundation website, which is a wonderful resource. It also hyperlinks to other websites that can provide, real, understandable information on potassium content, as well as other videos and tutorials that are out there. The National Kidney Disease Education Program that has been funded and supported through the National Institutes of Health has wonderful patient education, and in fact, and it's great. I refer patients to that a lot. If they are savvy on a smartphone, there's so many apps now that they can access to that would be a little bit easier, but that's a tremendous website and has just about every food you can think of.
Another question that was put on was, when should I start paying attention to my potassium? And as I mentioned in earlier discussion here, that's one of the common questions that I get. I quizzed my partners and I quizzed other people about high blood potassiums, and each one of us has our own threshold, if you will, for potassium. I don't know if you have a threshold.
Mm-hmm. Right.
My threshold is anything less than 6. Normal potassium is less than 5.5, and in some labs it's less than 5, but in most labs it's between 3.5 and 5.5. So anytime it starts getting up in those 5 ranges, people get a little anxious, and then any time it gets 6 or more, that's when I get anxious,
right.
And I need to do something about that. Now, some of my partners use that number of 5.5 as a religion, and they just say that if the potassium is above 5.5, they're going to do something about that. I think that it's important for you out there to understand that perhaps the best way to know whether your potassium is a problem is to ask your physician, because every nephrologist has a different idea about what the high potassium is, and in some cases you have to know the person's history, you have to know their blood sugar control, you have to know whether or not they got an acid problem, you have to know the degree of their heart disease, all the meds that they're on, and so judging any one number is a difficult to say. So what I would just say is that to those of you who asked the question about what my potassium number should be, that your physician is best to be able to determine that.
I would agree.
We have another question from the website, and that is, how can I find a renal dietitian?
Okay. You can actually go to the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. The website is eatright.org, and you can type in, what region you're in. You can find dietitians, and then it'll give their subspecialty practices, renal being one of them. Also, the National Kidney Foundation has wonderful councils throughout the country, and I've been very active for years in those, and so we can get you connected with a dietitian that specializes in this treatment area.
The Council on Renal Nutrition is
it's
where
an
I
outstanding,
go to,
outstanding.
at the Kidney Foundation. So. We are just having another question posted on the website, and then can you please address patients with IgA nephropathy post-transplant? Well, so IgA nephropathy is a kidney disease where the body has a certain immune protein that sticks inside the kidney. It's called immunoglobulin A, or IgA. The French like their own term, and the French call this disease Berger's disease. It's spelled in burgers, B-E-R-G-E-R-S, or in our country, but it's actually pronounced Berger's in France. It's the most common cause of kidney disease in France. So IgA nephropathy, unfortunately, has a number of different manifestations. The most common manifestation is just blood and protein in the urine without much decrease in kidney function. But in some cases, it can actually be quite an aggressive disease. And in those cases where it's an aggressive disease, where it is causing decreasing protein or decreasing kidney function, increasing protein, and you have a more rapid loss of kidney function, I've seen some cases of IgA disease where they're losing 5 or 10 or 15% of kidney function per year. In that situation, high blood potassium and high blood phosphorus can be a very difficult problem. Now, for those of you who have IgA nephropathy and are just spilling protein, okay, I do not recommend protein restriction in somebody with nephrotic syndrome. In fact, I would like to ask Laura the same question. In those patients who have nephrotic syndrome, and the most important part to me there is a low salt diet, how do you counsel somebody with nephrotic, where they're losing lots of protein in the urine? How do you counsel somebody with that?
Carefully. All right, so yes, that's true. We would not restrict protein according to what normal recommendations would be. However, I will mention that most Americans consume 2 to 3 times more protein than they need. So it may feel a little more like a restriction because you don't want to totally overtax the kidneys. It can be a dangerous situation. So again, it's working with the patient, looking at what they're consuming, animal versus vegetable proteins, the amount. But yes, technically it is not a protein restriction, but for some it may feel that way if they're over-consuming it.
I don't know if you put a number to it, but whenever I'm asked about that, I usually say between 1 and 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram per body weight per day.
It depends. 1 is probably safe. I may not go up as high as 1.5, depending on the individual, of course. But if you look at the recommendations, it's generally about 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. So 1 is actually higher, but you wouldn't want to push it too high, depending on what their situation would be.
Next question from the website is, can you adapt to higher potassium levels over time with long-term kidney disease? And now there's a controversial question that you'll get lots of different responses from nephrologists. It does turn out that some of the highest blood potassiums that I've ever seen have been with dialysis patients, where dialysis patients have come into the emergency room with potassiums of 9 and still alive.
Right.
And that can be quite surprising. Most of the time, if the potassium's 8 or 9, they're in cardiac arrest or near cardiac arrest, and we're using medications to try to reverse cardiac disease.
Right.
But I have seen patients walk into the emergency room with a potassium of 9, and so that gets to this question that you're asking, that patients who have chronic kidney disease and are on dialysis, I would say, any potassium that gets higher than 6, I still think you're taking some chances, but it is true that I see some of my dialysis patients have potassiums of 6 and 6.5, and when I do an EKG on them, their EKG is normal. And so in that situation, they have probably adapted to a little bit of a higher potassium, but I would not say that to anybody who is not on dialysis, because as I said, whenever I've seen somebody not on dialysis with those kinds of very high potassiums, those folks are generally quite ill, in my experience.
Yeah, I agree.
So, yeah.
I can think of that too.
Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for now, but you can also ask questions on my blog. Turns out I have a blog called Ask the Doctor, and the link is shown on your screen. It's www.kidney.org/kidney-disease/askthedoctor, or by contacting the National Kidney Foundation's Help Center by calling toll-free at 1-855-NKF-CARES. Or you can email us by asking questions to nkfcares@kidney.org. On behalf of the National Kidney Foundation, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Relentless, for their support and generosity in making this program possible. I'd especially like to thank Dr. Laura Byam-Gray for joining us here today and providing her with her time and expertise in discussing this very important topic. So, until next time, I'd like to wish you all good health and good luck.